this video, we are going to explore some of the commonly used annotations in a Spring Boot application. In one of our previous videos, we talked about Spring Boot application annotation, which is typically added on the main entry point class, which has this main method, which starts our Spring Boot application. Basically, this annotation is a meta annotation which enables the auto configuration mechanism, and also it is one of the Spring configuration class. So when you have this annotation, this is where Spring Boot will start scanning for all the Spring components and then perform auto registration of the components from the framework and everything. So we have already talked about this one. And next, we have already talked about some of the annotations that we typically use to register Spring beans. We can use add component, add controller, add service, repository, and bean. These are the annotations that we usually use to register our Spring beans. In this video, we are going to talk about a few other commonly used annotations like this, and we will explore where and how to use these annotations. Let us start with add controller. So when we are building a web application, we can create a controller and use this annotation to configure a controller and then define some of the HTTP request handler methods. So before doing that, first let us add the TimeLeaf starter. So earlier we have commented it out. Now we are adding it to our application TimeLeaf. And once we add this TimeLeaf starter, Spring Boot will automatically configure the TimeLeaf support, and it is expecting us to put all the TimeLeaf templates in this SRC main resources templates folder. So let us go ahead and create a HTML file and give it a name home. So we have just very basic HTML file inside our templates folder. Now I have created a simple class demo controller, and now we are going to learn how to use add controller annotation and handle a request which will render this home.html template. So what I'm going to do, I will make this as a controller by adding this annotation add controller, and then we can write handler request handler methods by using which is a return type is string, which is going to return the name of the template, and I am going to return home. And I also need to specify which URL this is going to handle. For that, I can use request mapping and specify home. Also, I can specify which method I want to handle it. So I want to handle for HTTP request get type. Okay. So now with this code, now let us run this application. And if we access this /home URL, we should be seeing the response from this view template. Now let us go to here and call /home. So it rendered this web page from this template. So this is how we can create the a simple controller and create a request handler method and then render a response from the template. And here, if you notice, we are using add request mapping and then specifying the path that we want to handle from this method and specifying which method we want to handle. So here we specifically mention get. If you don't mention this, it will handle all types of request methods, get, post, or anything like that. Because this is a common pattern, instead of using request mapping, Spring Boot team created a dedicated annotations for handling such requests. So instead of doing like this, you can simply use add get mapping and simply specify the path here. You don't need to explicitly mention what type of request method we are handling. And similarly, you can use post mapping, patch mapping, put mapping, delete mapping, all these specific request method type annotations we have. Okay, so this is how we can use at controller and at request mapping and at get mapping also to render a web page. Let's say if we have multiple such request handler methods and which require some common from one, something like this, say let's say page 1 and similarly page 2. So I'm just giving an example of if you have such common prefix for all the request handler methods, instead of duplicating that, what you can do, you can actually use this at request mapping annotation and specify that common prefix here, and you can remove it from the specific handler methods. So all the request handler methods here will inherit this common prefix, and when you start the application you will be able to access this handler /home/page1/home/page2 like this. So if you have usually in a REST API you will put /API/ something which is common for all the request handler methods, so that you don't have to repeat that. So that is one thing to remember. We have seen how we can implement a request handler method that will render a web page as a response from TimeLift template. But what about returning a response like a REST API response in the JSON format? So let us see how we can do that. Again, let's imagine we are implementing some a health API endpoint, and it is going to return some string, just okay. So if we do that, it is going to expect to return a response from the template ok.html from the templates folder. But if we want to return JSON based response, we can add this at response body annotation. So what will this do? It is going to convert whatever the value we are returning into JSON response by default and then return to the caller. So instead of trying to render this from the templates, using this annotation will make Spring Boot to convert the response into JSON and then return it. So let us restart and then try to access this /health. So here we can see it is returning OK from the response, whatever the value we are returning. So instead of returning a simple string, if you want to return some JSON structure, we can do something like this. So here we can say map.status up, and if we restart this, so what Spring Boot will do, whatever the value we are returning is Spring Boot is going to use Jackson library behind the scenes and then convert this into JSON response and then return it because of this at response body. So again, now if we try to access this, you can see it is returning JSON based response here. So that is how we can return. But when you are building completely a REST API, not a typical web application, so this is going to be common, like you can use add controller on the class level and then you have to add this annotation for every request handler method. So to simplify that, instead of adding this for every method, they have created a annotation called REST controller, which is nothing but a combination of add controller and response body. So instead of using add controller, if you are building a REST API, you can use that, and let's comment this out for now, and you can remove this. So we use add REST controller and then we just add get mapping or post mapping, whatever, and you don't need to add this add response body. So now if we restart, it is going to automatically, whatever the value you are returning it is going to try to marshal that value into JSON and then return the response. So here you still get the JSON response. So that's how you can use, depending on whether you are building a REST API or a typical web application, you can choose either add controller or add REST controller. Typically, when you are requesting a URL and if the request handler method successfully completed and returned the response, it is going to return status code HTTP 200 OK. Let's verify that once. So here if I access health endpoint, here you can see the status code is 200. Now if you want to change that status code to a different value, you can use this annotation at response status, and you can specify by default it is going to return OK 200, but for whatever reason if you want to change, so typically when you are implementing a post mapping to create a new resource, you should be returning the proper HTTP status code 201. So in such cases you can use this annotation to return a different status code other than OK. You can even return OK, but that is the default. You don't have to use this specifically. But if you want to return any other status code apart from 200, you can use this annotation. So let us restart and then verify. When we access this health endpoint, we should be getting a status code of 201. Refresh. Here you can see it is returning 201 as a response status code. So we have seen how to use request mapping and get mapping. Similarly, we can use other annotations like post mapping, put mapping, patch, delete mapping. So let us see how we can use add post mapping. So in the same controller, let's create another request handler method, and this time we are using add post mapping, which handles the URL pattern of /API/users. And here we are returning status code 201. And in this we don't have any business logic here, and we are simply returning a map and with the status and success. Okay, so now let us restart, and if we invoke this post API endpoint, we are going to get the response with status : success as a JSON response and status code as created 200. So let us see how we can invoke that. So this is in IntelliJIDEA Ultimate Edition. We have HTTP console where we can use this to invoke API endpoints. Here you can see status code 201 and response body is status success. Instead of returning map, we can also return any object, and Springboot will take care of converting that into JSON using Jackson library under the hood. So let's create a simple record with status of status property, and here instead of returning map, let us return this object type. So let's say success. Now let's restart. So here you can see it is working same with the status code 201. We have seen how we can use add post mapping annotation to handle a post request, HTTP post request. Similarly, you can use other annotations like put mapping, patch, delete mapping, etc. to handle their respective HTTP method types. Now let us take a look at how we can use add path variable annotation. So in our controller, let's write a handler for returning a user information for the given ID. So what we can do, we can use at get mapping /API/users/ID. So this is the dynamic part that can be changing based on the value that users pass. So we are using this notation of flower braces to specify some dynamic value here, and we don't need response body, and let us return a user information, get user by ID, and we need to take that dynamic part value here so that we can fetch the information of that particular user by this ID and then return. Let's create a record here. Okay, so how do we get this dynamic value into this ID variable? This is where we can use add path variable, and Springboot is going to pass this value and then populate it into ID value. And if these names of the parameters are same, you don't need to do anything else. But if you name it as a different, if you give this value a different name, then you need to explicitly say what path variable you want to map to this variable, because the name here in this URL pattern is different from the value from the name that you use here. So that's why you need to explicitly specify, because there can be a number of parameters. So you want to specify which dynamic property value you want to bind to this variable. So this is how you can do this. And here again you can return some whatever the value, most likely you will get it from database or somewhere, and then you can return it like this. So this is how you can use path variable. Let us just verify whether it works or not. And we can invoke that into, this is the dynamic value here. Let me pass it as 1. And here I got the value ID 1 and user 1. So Spring Boot is parsing this URL pattern and then taking this value and binding it to this variable name. Now let us take a look at how we can use @request_param annotation to bind the query parameter values into our properties. So here let us write another request handler method to fetch all the users information. So I'm going to use again get mapping, and it is going to handle /API/users, and it is going to return a list of users. Okay, we are returning some dummy values here. So imagine if we are expecting some kind of we want to do some kind of a pagination where we are expecting the users to specify localhost 8080/API/users, and then we are expecting the users to specify page number equals to 1, 2, 3, whatever the number they want to get. Instead of getting all the users at once, we are expecting the users to pass page number, so that we are only going to get that page number based on the page number and then the amount of users we want to return. We are going to fetch the data from the database and then return it. Okay, that is the use case we are trying to handle. And how we can specify to capture such request query parameter like request param, and specify name equal to page, and by default if we don't specify anything it is considered as a required parameter, and then let's make it as long page. So we are not going to implement that pagination logic here, but we are going to simply print this here. And if we rerun and try to access this without passing this page variable, it is going to throw exception saying that it is expecting this query parameter. Let's verify that. So here it is already showing that we need to pass this page parameter some value, but let's try not passing that. So it is going to give bad request exception because it is expecting to get the page number as a request parameter. Okay, so what we can do, let's try passing that page number, page equals to 1. Now if we, it will return some sample data that we are returning from our controller. Okay, we are returning this sample data, and we can see it print this page number 1 also. So what if it is not a required parameter? Then here we can specify required equal to false. Fine, but if we are making it as an optional parameter, most likely we would also specify a default value also. So by default page number would be 1. So that is the default value. So if we are specifying a default value, we don't need to specify required equals to true or false, because if it is user passed the page request query parameter, it is going to take it. If it is not, it is going to take this default value. So when you specify default value, you don't need to specify required equals to false. Okay, now if we refresh and try to access this, let's say I want to pass a page number 3, and in that case it should get page number 3, and if I don't pass anything, it should get default page number 1. So that is how you can bind request query parameters using @request_param annotation, and you can also specify default value. And again, in the same way, if the parameter name and actual query parameter name are same, you don't need to specify explicitly what is the name of it. So finally, let us take a look at this @request_body annotation. So while building REST APIs, typically for post request, you may need to pass some JSON body where you take that payload and then bind it to some object and then process it in whatever the way you want to process. So here, for example, in our post mapping, we are not currently taking any input, but let's imagine we want to take a user object as an input, which means the user will pass a JSON representation of the user object, and Spring needs to convert that payload into user object. So for that to happen, you need to use this request body annotation, so that Spring Boot is going to take a post body payload and then convert it into user object and then pass it to the method. So now let us take a look at how we can invoke this. Let us restart. And okay, let's print the user information as well. And here we have post. Let us specify content type application JSON, and this is going to be the body. ID equals to 1, name is Siva, so something like this. So let us run this post method, and if you take a look at, so Spring Boot take that body, request body, and bind it to user object. Here we can see both the values are populated into user object. So that is how you can use @request_body annotation to pass the request body and then bind it to whatever the object you want to bind it. So this is how we can use various annotations, and we are going to use most of these annotations while building our blog application. And these are not all, there are a lot more annotations, but these are good enough to know and then get started working on our application. I hope this overview of what are the annotations we most commonly used in our applications is helpful to get started with our application. And thanks for watching. See you in the next video. Bye bye.